In the depths of winter 1942, a child's scream echoed through the sterile corridors of Block 10 at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the smell of disinfectant could not mask the stench of human suffering. The white coat, that sacred symbol of healing, had become a shroud of terror, transforming those who wore it from healers into harbingers of unimaginable horror. What began as perverted curiosity would evolve into systematic torture masquerading as science, conducted by men who had once sworn an oath to first do no harm. This is the story of how medicine itself became a weapon of genocide, and how the very institutions meant to preserve life became laboratories of death. The morning mist clung to the barbed wire like ghostly fingers as Dr. Josef Mengele made his rounds through the camp, his polished boots clicking against the concrete with metronomic precision. Behind those steel-rimmed glasses lay eyes that saw human beings not as patients, but as specimens, living test subjects in experiments that would make the Marquis de Sade recoil in disgust. The children called him the Angel of Death, a nickname that captured the terrible irony of his presence. He came bearing the tools of medicine, yet delivered only suffering and mortality. In the cold, fluorescent light of the medical blocks, where the Hippocratic Oath had been perverted beyond recognition, Mengele and his colleagues conducted procedures that stripped away not only flesh and bone, but the very essence of human dignity itself. His laboratory notebooks, discovered decades later, revealed the methodical nature of his madness. Each entry written in precise scientific language that failed to acknowledge the humanity of his subjects, referring to children by numbers and symptoms rather than names and dreams. The Holocaust differs from other instances of mass murder in that it was medically sanctioned genocide, a systematic program that transformed the entire medical establishment into an instrument of death. This clinical observation reveals the most chilling aspect of Nazi medical experiments. They were not the aberrant actions of isolated madmen, but systematic programs endorsed by the highest levels of the medical establishment, universities, pharmaceutical companies, and government institutions. The experiments fell into several categories, each more horrifying than the last. High-altitude experiments that subjected prisoners to conditions simulating extreme altitudes until they lost consciousness and died. Freezing experiments where victims were immersed in ice water or left naked in sub-freezing temperatures to study hypothermia. Malaria experiments where healthy prisoners were infected with malaria, then treated with various drugs to test their efficacy. Sterilization experiments that sought to develop efficient methods for the mass sterilization of people deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Poison experiments where prisoners were secretly given lethal substances in their food. And bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration, experiments that involved deliberate breaking, burning, and infecting of limbs to study healing processes. Each category represented not merely individual cruelty, but institutional complicity on a scale that defied comprehension. The psychological landscape of these experiments was perhaps even more disturbing than their physical brutality, revealing how ordinary human beings could transform themselves into monsters through a process of moral disengagement and ideological indoctrination. Robert J. Lifton, the renowned psychiatrist and historian, spent years studying the Nazi doctor's mentality, interviewing survivors and perpetrators alike in an effort to understand how healing could become torture. His research revealed a phenomenon he termed doubling, the psychological means by which one invokes the evil potential of the self, a defense mechanism that allowed doctors to maintain two separate psychological selves, the loving family man and the cold-blooded experimenter. These doctors didn't see themselves as monsters. Rather, they convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose, advancing the cause of German medicine, contributing to the war effort, or purifying the human race. They rationalized their actions through a twisted logic that portrayed their victims as less than human, as life unworthy of life, while simultaneously believing they were advancing medical science for the benefit of future generations. This psychological mechanism allowed them to maintain their self-image as healers, even while they tortured and murdered, demonstrating the terrifying capacity of human beings to justify the most heinous acts through ideological conviction. The participation of numerous German physicians in criminal medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners was a particularly drastic instance of the trampling of medical ethics, revealing how quickly professional standards could collapse under political pressure and ideological fervor. The scope of participation was staggering. Hundreds of doctors, nurses, and medical researchers became complicit in these atrocities, from prestigious university professors to young medical students eager to advance their careers. They were not coerced. Many volunteered, seeing an opportunity to advance their careers, pursue research that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, or serve what they believed was the greater good of German science. The experiments were often conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized legitimate medical research, complete with detailed documentation, statistical analysis, peer review, and publication in medical journals. This veneer of scientific respectability made the crimes all the more heinous, as it demonstrated how easily the institutions of healing could be corrupted and weaponized. Medical conferences discussed the findings from concentration camp experiments as if they were legitimate research, while pharmaceutical companies provided drugs and equipment for testing on prisoners. The corruption extended to the highest levels of German medicine, with medical school deans, journal editors, and professional associations all complicit in legitimizing torture as science. The experiments on twins conducted primarily by Mengele represent perhaps the most infamous chapter in this dark history, a nightmare that transformed children into laboratory animals and siblings into unwilling participants in their own destruction. At the age of 10, twins Eva and Miriam Moses were taken to Auschwitz, where Dr. Josef Mengele used them for medical experiments. Children as young as 5 years old were subjected to painful procedures without anesthesia, had needles inserted into their eyes to change their color, were infected with diseases, and had limbs amputated or organs removed to study the effects on their surviving twin. Eva Moses Kor, one of the few survivors of Mengele's twin experiments, later recalled being injected with unknown substances that made her violently ill, while her sister Miriam received different injections as part of a comparative study designed to measure the effects of various pathogens and treatments. The twins were kept alive only as long as they served the experiment's purpose. Once their usefulness ended, they were murdered so their organs could be examined and compared post-mortem. The surviving documentation reveals experiments that involved sewing twins together to create artificial conjoined twins, and attempts to change gender through hormone injections and surgical procedures. One survivor recalled watching other twin pairs disappear overnight, never to be seen again, while she and her sister lived in constant terror of being selected for the next round of experiments. High-altitude experiments conducted at Dachau by Dr. Sigmund Rascher were designed to help German pilots survive at extreme altitudes, but quickly devolved into sadistic studies that served no legitimate scientific purpose. Prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 68,000 feet, where they suffered excruciating decompression sickness as the air was gradually pumped out of the chamber. Many lost consciousness and died, while others suffered permanent brain damage, ruptured lungs, or embolisms as air bubbles formed in their blood. Rascher meticulously documented their agonized convulsions and desperate gasps for air, treating their suffering as mere data points in his research while filming their deaths for later analysis. The surviving documentation reveals the cold, clinical language used to describe these tortures. Subjects were referred to by numbers rather than names, their pain dismissed as reactions or responses to experimental conditions. Himmler pressured the investigators into carrying out his proposals and expressed special interest in the hypothermia project, and travelled to Dachau several times to witness experiments. The chamber experiments continued long after any useful data could have been obtained, suggesting that scientific curiosity had given way to sadistic fascination with human suffering. Witnesses later testified that Rascher seemed to take pleasure in watching his victims die, often extending experiments beyond their original parameters simply to observe the final moments of human life. The freezing experiments, also conducted by Rascher at Dachau, subjected prisoners to conditions that ostensibly simulated those faced by German soldiers on the Russian front, but actually served as pretexts for prolonged torture disguised as scientific research. Many experiments were conducted on captured Soviet troops. The Nazis wondered whether their genetics gave them superior resistance to cold. Victims were immersed in tanks of ice water or left naked outdoors in sub-freezing temperatures, while their body temperatures were monitored until they lost consciousness or died. Russia reported that death occurred in 53 to 100 minutes after immersion, but the experiments continued far beyond the point where any useful medical knowledge could have been obtained. Some experiments involved attempts to rewarm the victims using various methods, including forcing them into beds with naked women, a procedure that added sexual humiliation to physical torture while providing no meaningful scientific data. Dr. Sigmund Rasche used about 300 prisoners in experiments recording their shock from the exposure to cold. The stated purpose was to develop effective treatments for hypothermia, but the experiments revealed a sadistic attention to detail that suggested the true motivation was the infliction of suffering, rather than the advancement of medical knowledge. Survivors described how Rasche would adjust water temperatures and exposure times to prolong the agony of his victims, taking detailed notes on their final words, their desperate attempts to escape the water, and the exact moment when life left their bodies. Sterilization experiments represented another horrific dimension of Nazi medical research, as doctors sought to develop efficient methods for rendering entire populations infertile in service of the Nazi goal of racial purification. Dr. Karl Klauberg injected caustic substances directly into women's fallopian tubes, causing excruciating pain, severe internal bleeding, and permanent sterility. The injections often resulted in peritonitis, sepsis, and death, but Klauberg continued his work with clinical detachment, viewing each death as a learning opportunity rather than a human tragedy. Dr. Horst Schumann used massive doses of X-rays to destroy reproductive organs, often causing severe burns, cancer, and systemic radiation poisoning that led to slow, agonizing deaths months or years later. These experiments were conducted with the explicit goal of supporting Nazi population policies that sought to eliminate entire ethnic groups through mass sterilization rather than immediate murder. The victims were not informed of the procedure's purpose, and were often told they were receiving medical treatment for other conditions, adding betrayal and deception to their physical suffering. Women subjected to these experiments later described the horror of realizing they had been deliberately sterilized, the crushing knowledge that their ability to have children had been destroyed, not by disease or accident, but by deliberate human cruelty. The psychological trauma often proved as devastating as the physical injuries, as survivors struggled with feelings of violation, loss, and the knowledge that they had been targeted for elimination from the human gene pool. The malaria experiments conducted primarily at Dachau involved the deliberate infection of healthy prisoners with various strains of malaria to test the effectiveness of different anti-malarial drugs. Prisoners were infected through injections of live malaria parasites or by being bitten by infected mosquitoes, then observed as the disease progressed through their bodies. Many died from the malaria itself, while others succumbed to the experimental treatments, which included untested drugs, extreme temperature therapies, and surgical procedures designed to study the disease's effects on various organs. The experiments were ostensibly designed to help German troops fighting in tropical climates, but they continued long after effective anti-malarial treatments were already known, suggesting that the true purpose was to study the progression of disease in human subjects rather than to develop new treatments. Survivors described the horror of watching fellow prisoners burn with fever, become delirious, and die in agony, while doctors recorded their symptoms with clinical detachment. The malaria experiments revealed another dimension of Nazi medical cruelty: the transformation of infectious disease into a weapon of torture, using pathogens as instruments of slow death while maintaining the pretense of scientific research. Poison experiments represented perhaps the most cowardly form of Nazi medical experimentation, as prisoners were secretly given lethal substances in their food or drink without their knowledge, then observed as they died slow, agonizing deaths. Various poisons were tested, including cyanide, strychnine, and other toxins, with researchers documenting the time to death, the progression of symptoms, and the effectiveness of different dosages. The victims had no opportunity to prepare for death, no chance to say goodbye to loved ones, and no knowledge of why they were suddenly experiencing excruciating pain and organ failure. The poison experiments revealed the depths of Nazi medical depravity, demonstrating how doctors could transform even the basic human need for food and water into sources of terror and death. The clinical documentation of these experiments shows researchers discussing optimal dosages and delivery methods with the same detachment they might use to discuss vitamin supplements, revealing a complete disconnection from the humanity of their victims. Bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments involved the deliberate breaking of healthy bones, the severing of muscles and nerves, and the infection of wounds to study healing processes under controlled conditions. Prisoners had their arms and legs broken with hammers, had muscles cut away from their bones, and had nerves severed to study the effects of various treatments on recovery. Many of these wounds were deliberately infected with bacteria, glass, or other foreign substances to study the body's response to contamination. The stated purpose was to develop better treatments for German soldiers wounded in combat, but the experiments continued long after any useful medical knowledge had been obtained, suggesting that the true motivation was sadistic curiosity about human pain and suffering. Survivors described the horror of having healthy limbs deliberately broken and infected, then being forced to endure weeks or months of agony, while researchers observed the healing process with clinical interest. The bone experiments revealed the Nazi transformation of medical knowledge into an instrument of torture, using understanding of human physiology not to heal, but to cause maximum suffering while maintaining the pretense of scientific research. The aftermath of these experiments extended far beyond the war's end, creating a legacy of trauma that affected not only direct survivors, but their families and communities for generations. Many victims who survived suffered lifelong physical and psychological trauma that no amount of medical treatment could fully heal. Women who underwent sterilization experiments lived with chronic pain and internal scarring. Children subjected to growth experiments, twin studies, or limb surgeries bore visible reminders of their torture throughout their lives, physical scars that served as permanent monuments to human cruelty. The psychological impact was equally devastating, as survivors struggled with trauma, survivors' guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives after experiencing the ultimate betrayal by the medical profession. Many survivors never again trusted doctors or hospitals, living with untreated medical conditions rather than risk re-experiencing the trauma of medical procedures. Eva Kor likened forgiveness of her tormentors to chemotherapy, saying, "Forgiveness is really nothing more than an act of self-healing." But even her remarkable journey toward forgiveness could not erase the permanent damage inflicted by Nazi medical experiments. The families of survivors also bore the burden of these experiments, as children and grandchildren grew up in households marked by trauma, mistrust, and the constant presence of physical and emotional scars. Many survivors could never speak about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence for decades, while others became consumed by the need to bear witness, dedicating their lives to ensuring the world would never forget what had been done to them. The ripple effects of Nazi medical experiments extended through generations, affecting family relationships, career choices, and fundamental attitudes toward medicine and authority. Communities that had lost significant portions of their population to these experiments struggled to rebuild, carrying the collective memory of betrayal by the medical profession and the knowledge that healing had been transformed into harm. Testimonies of living individuals who were subjected to Nazi medical experiments delivered first-hand testimony of the atrocities of the Holocaust. These testimonies reveal not only the specific horrors of individual experiments, but the broader context of dehumanization that made such cruelty possible. Survivors described the gradual process by which they ceased to be seen as human beings and became objects of scientific curiosity, their pain and fear dismissed as irrelevant data points in the grand scheme of Nazi research. Their words reveal the psychological torture that accompanied physical suffering, as victims realized that those charged with their care had become their tormentors, that the institutions of healing had been perverted into instruments of destruction. The legal reckoning that followed the war established new international standards for medical research, but justice for the victims remained elusive and incomplete. The Nuremberg medical trial of 1947 addressed the absence of consent in Nazi experiments and formulated the principle of informed consent for the first time on an international level, creating the Nuremberg Code that remains foundational to medical ethics today. However, many of the doctors who conducted these experiments escaped prosecution entirely, fleeing to South America, assuming new identities, or disappearing into the chaos of post-war Europe. Others received relatively light sentences before resuming their medical careers, returning to positions of authority and respect in the very profession they had disgraced. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the most notorious of the Nazi doctors, lived freely in South America for decades before dying of natural causes in 1979, never having faced trial for his crimes against humanity. The incomplete nature of post-war justice meant that many victims never saw their tormentors held accountable, adding another layer of trauma to their already overwhelming burden of suffering. The legacy of Nazi medical experiments continues to haunt the medical profession today, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between medicine and power, the vulnerability of patients to abuse, and the responsibility of the medical community to police its own members. The Nuremberg Code, developed in response to these atrocities, established 10 principles for ethical human experimentation that remain foundational to medical research ethics worldwide. The principle of informed consent, the requirement that experiments serve the greater good of society, and the mandate that subjects be free to end their participation at any time, all emerged directly from the horror of what happened in Nazi camps. Yet questions remain about how medical professionals could have so thoroughly abandoned their ethical obligations. What warning signs might have prevented such systematic abuse? And what safeguards exist to prevent such betrayals in the future? Modern medical ethicists continue to grapple with the complex questions raised by Nazi medical experiments, particularly the issue of whether any knowledge gained through torture can ever be considered legitimate or useful. Should research data obtained through the systematic torture and murder of innocent people ever be used, even if it might save lives? How can the medical profession maintain public trust while acknowledging its dark history of complicity in genocide? What responsibility do medical institutions bear for educating future doctors about these atrocities and the ethical principles that emerged from them? These questions have taken on new urgency in recent decades as revelations have emerged about unethical medical research conducted by democratic governments, including the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States, MK-Ultra mind control experiments conducted by the CIA, and radiation experiments on unwitting subjects. The legacy of Nazi medical experiments serves as a constant reminder that the corruption of medicine is not limited to totalitarian regimes, that the potential for abuse exists wherever power imbalances allow researchers to treat human beings as objects rather than subjects. The transformation of medicine from healing to harming during the Nazi era reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the fragility of ethical systems under pressure. The doctors who conducted these experiments were not born monsters. They were ordinary people who allowed ideology, ambition, and institutional pressure to override their moral compass. They were products of the same medical schools, the same professional organizations, and the same ethical traditions that produced thousands of healers who never betrayed their oath. This recognition makes their crimes even more disturbing, as it reveals how easily anyone might be corrupted under the right circumstances, how quickly professional standards can collapse when challenged by political authority, and how dangerous it is to assume that education and training alone can prevent moral failure. The children's voices that once echoed through the medical blocks of Auschwitz have long since fallen silent. But their stories continue to resonate as a warning about the fragility of human dignity in the face of institutional power. The white coats that once symbolized healing became stained with the blood of innocence, a reminder that no profession, no matter how noble its stated purpose, is immune to corruption when it abandons its ethical foundations. In examining this dark chapter of history, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the ease with which ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. The Nazi medical experiments represent not merely historical aberrations, but ongoing challenges to our understanding of medical ethics, human rights, and the responsibilities that come with the power to heal or harm.